Okay, last week, after a long, hard road, we finished Galatians. We finally did it. We got all the way through, and it was really, really cool. That was, aside from the book of Acts and some other books, I haven't ever done a from beginning to end study. Usually it's like taking a section of scripture and breaking it down or whatever else. But that's the first epistle that I've been able to do in full with people who are kind of following along. So that was really fun. I really enjoyed it, and I think some of you guys did as well. So we're going to continue that with 1 Corinthians, which is potentially even scarier because Galatians is 6 chapters. Anyone know how many chapters 1 Corinthians is?
20-something.
Anyone?
Is it 13?
16.
16
Wow.
chapters. Now, there is a difference in that Galatians is extremely, it's full of really hard things to understand. Paul makes a lot of statements that are weighty, and they're just hard, heavy statements. 1 Corinthians is a lot lighter, for the most part because he's dealing with more base issues. Things like morality and things like getting along and stuff like that are a lot different from things like understanding the heart of the gospel and understanding the heart of the external law and faith versus works and all that stuff. It's just a lighter thing in general. But this is where we're going to start. It is 16 chapters, but I want to see if we can set a pace aside from tonight. And it might be a little bit shorter tonight. We're just going to go through the necessary background, historical context stuff, and then we'll just be done at whatever time we finish. And I say that not because it'll be like 3 hours, but because it'll probably be like half an hour to 45 minutes, if I were to guess. Be a little bit shorter, and then we'll just be done for tonight, and we'll pick up in chapter 1 next week. If you guys remember with the Galatians, it took us 3 weeks to do the preliminary stuff before we could get into the book, because there's just so much that you have to understand before you can really get into stuff. So this week it should just be one, because it's a lot more straightforward. And I want to see if we can set a decent pace and get through all 16 chapters without taking a year and a half to do it. So we'll start right at the beginning. How many of you guys have read 1 Corinthians before? All the way through? Okay. Do you remember anything about it? Does anybody remember anything about 1 Corinthians?
There's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, well, chapter 13, everyone knows 1 Corinthians 13, and it's the love chapter, and that's like the only chapter anyone likes from Corinthians, unless they go into the stuff where...
Fruit. Is that that one?
No, that was Galatians. You missed all that stuff, sorry. The other thing people like to go into in Corinthians is the stuff he talks about, the gifts of the Spirit, when he goes into that stuff. Not the fruit of the Spirit, but the gifts of the Spirit, spiritual gifts. Those are really the only two things people really like to talk about in Corinthians, because most of it is kind of nitty-gritty dealing with issues that people have. But as always, just like we do with Corinthians, there's stuff that we want to talk about and get in our heads ahead of time before we just jump into chapter 1. We want to get an idea of what the church was like, what the author was like, why it was being written, some of the events that were surrounding his writing. And really, it's nowhere near as complex as what was going on around the church in Galatia, but it's still necessary to kind of get an idea, and it really kind of fleshes the whole thing out as we begin to study when you have the context in your head. So, way back before we even started Corinthians, we did a bit of a primer on how to study the Bible and asking the right questions and that sort of thing to get an idea about the context. You guys remember what one of the first questions you want to ask is? Who's the author? Is one of the first ones. Mm-hmm. When? All the W questions, the who and the why and the where and the when and all that stuff. And the what is a really big deal as well. That's probably the first one I like to start with is the what. So within the Bible we know there's a lot of different literary genres. So what kind of literary genre are we looking at? It's a letter. It's very different from a historical narrative or something like that, like Acts, where you have this historical account of like this 30 to 40 year period. You have it as a letter written by one guy to one other guy or to another group of people. So obviously it's very different, and you want to read it very differently. And every letter has an author, and every letter has an audience. So who's the author?
Paul.
Paul. Prove it. You're good.
I don't know.
He does say, he does say
Yeah.
Paul, right? He says Paul, comma, yada, 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 yada.
Right to the church of Corinth.
Yeah. Now, we're lucky in this because there's really no modern scholar of any kind of repute that denies that Paul's the author. This is kind of one of the letters where it's really well attested. Church fathers throughout history they've all been really clear that Paul wrote this letter. There are some other books where people would say, Paul didn't write this, and the literary style is different here and there, and you can get into a lot of debate and stuff like that. As for me, in terms of my literary criticism background, I haven't found any compelling reasons to say that the letters that are claimed to be written by Paul are not. But with Corinthians, it's pretty cut and dry. It's Paul who wrote the letter, and then who did he write it to?
Corinth, the church.
The church in Corinth. Just like he wrote the second letter to Corinthians to the church in Corinth. So with Corinth, what do you guys know? Do you guys know anything about Corinth?
Maybe not.
Where it is? So here's a map. Over here we've got Jerusalem. There's Palestine. Any idea where Corinth would be? Trick question. It's not on that map.
Oh.
Here's a much bigger map. Over here you have Palestine, the Middle East, Egypt's down that way, and here's Italy. You go way over here.
Wow, it's in Italy.
Pardon me, this is not Italy. Italy's over here.
Oh.
This is Macedonia.
Oh.
Achaia. If you look over here, there's Corinth. So it's quite far away from Jerusalem at this point. This is most of the known world, and if you go way further over here, you get to Italy and Rome, okay, which Paul ended up going to at the end of Acts. But this is Corinth, way over here. It was a Roman city, and it was a fairly famous Roman city. It was famous for being kind of an intellectual hub, famous for having a lot of very smart people come out of it, and a lot of debate in and out of it. It was famous for material prosperity. It was a very wealthy city, a lot of wealthy people there. This region, see it says
Greece?
Achaia.
Close to Greece?
This is all Greece up here. This region, Achaia, it's the capital of the region. It was kind of honored with that status. Corinth was. So it was a big deal. It was a big deal city within Rome, and it also kind of functioned as a major port city as well. You had a lot of the passage ships coming through here from Rome to get to the rest of the known world, and they would pass through right here, Corinth, and Athens is right beside it. There was what's called an acropolis in pretty much every major Roman city. There was an acropolis. It was kind of the major hub. Okay, the acropolis in Corinth was actually the site of the temple, not just one of the temples, but the temple for the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So it was the site of the temple for the Greek goddess Aphrodite. What do you guys know about Aphrodite? She's the goddess of love. She's Venus in the Roman of the Roman gods. She was the goddess of beauty, the goddess of pleasure, and most importantly for us to understand also, she was the goddess of sex. Okay, this is what Aphrodite was all about: the physical pleasures, intimacy, that sort of thing. And what's interesting here is, and I'll just throw this out there. Within the temple, there were certain ways in which people would come and they would honor Aphrodite. Does anyone have any guesses what one of the most infamous ways that people would come to worship Aphrodite was?
Do it.
Yes.
Prostitution.
For lack of a better term, sure. The temple of Aphrodite in Corinth, this particular temple, housed specifically 1,000 cult prostitutes were in the temple. Okay, and that's where they stayed, and that's where they lived, and that's what they did. That was their job. They worked for the cult of Aphrodite as prostitutes. And so worshipers would come to worship Aphrodite by hiring one or more prostitutes, and that's how you honored the goddess Aphrodite. And so this is in Corinth, okay? And this was like the place. You're like, hey, let's go worship Aphrodite this weekend. Corinth is the place. And so, yeah, it was famous for its intellectualism. It was famous for its material wealth, but there was something it was even more famous for within the Roman Empire, and that was its corruption. It was its loose living. It's kind of like you talk about Vegas. in the U.S., what happens in Vegas, that whole thing. You go to Vegas to do whatever the heck you want, right? It's going to stay over there because that's how the people in Vegas do it. You just go over there and go crazy. Corinth was kind of the Vegas of the Roman Empire, right? There was even a phrase you'd say, let us live as the Corinthians do. Let's go crazy. Let's not worry about the consequences. Let's live loosely. Let's live riotously. It's funny, actually, about 200 years or so, 200 years or so before this letter was written, before the Roman Empire was fully established and Corinth was firmly part of the Grecian Empire, there was something called the Achaean League that rose up against the Roman Empire, and Corinth was a huge part of that. This massive riot, they started this rebellion against them, and Rome crushed it. And all of the temple and everything was destroyed in this massive fight. And they rebuilt all of it and all that good stuff. But yeah, this is what Corinth was known for. Okay, it was known for this kind of living, that kind of way of doing things. And so once again, if you're, say you're just like a Corinthian, you're a loose liver, you don't have high moral standards, you kind of go crazy. There we go. So that's Corinth. And that is the background that we need to have an idea of, because when you say the Corinthian church, it was a church in that city. Okay? It was a church in a city that was surrounded by those kind of moral standards. So obviously you can get the idea it's going to have some problems from the get-go. It's not a leap to say that it's going to have some, at the very least, some moral issues. So about the author, we say the place is Corinth, and the author is Paul, just like in Galatians. And I think we're all fairly familiar with Paul at this point. We know what he did and what he was doing and a lot of his passion here. Paul had one of the important things we need to know about him. He's one of the main characters in the book of Acts. Okay, starting in chapter 16, he is the main character. No holds barred. Okay, he's the character. It follows all the way to the end in chapter 28. It also follows him in chapter 9, in chapter 11, and in chapter 12. No, chapter 9, chapter 13, and 14. And it takes a break in 15 and then picks up again in 16. But really, the book of Acts follows him most of the time. And so in chapters 13 and 14, it follows this. Okay? This is his first missionary journey. And this is significant for you guys because he starts way up here in Antioch, he goes to Cyprus, and then this area up here, you see that? That's Galatia. These churches, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and Pisidian Antioch, these were the churches in Galatia. Okay? This is what he founded, this area over here, and this is who he was writing to when he wrote that letter. So this came about on his first missionary journey, and as a result, that's the reason why we looked at Galatians first, because it's kind of the first letter he wrote to the first churches that he founded. But then you go over here, because after he had this missionary journey, he ended up in Jerusalem again. And what he did was he went all the way back up to Antioch, and he started here. Okay? This is his starting point, and this is what his second missionary journey looks like, starting in chapter 16. Now, obviously, before he goes to Cyprus, and loops around here to Galatia, and then loops all the way back to Jerusalem. Okay? And then back to Antioch. In his second missionary journey, it has a much wider scale. It's huge. And this is a huge amount of ground he covered. Right here, this is about 200 miles, okay? And so this is all on foot. He's just traveling and then occasionally by boat up here as well. But the missionary journey took him about 2.5 years. It was just like,
let's go across Florida kind of thing.
Let's go on a journey and let's spread the gospel. And I'll be back in a few years, I guess.
The US.
And so it's pretty crazy, especially considering that the first missionary journey took him about 1.5 years. So since 1.5 years, he gets home. He's home for a short amount of time, and then he goes off again. It originally started, he wanted to go back through, you see how he goes through the Galatian churches again? His original purpose was to go back through to those churches and encourage them. You kind of build them up and make sure they were doing okay. And then you notice right about here, he suddenly launches way up here. And he didn't really know what to do. He talks about how he kind of lost his vision for a little bit. And then he wanted to go up to Bithynia, and it said the Holy Spirit wouldn't let him, basically. The way was blocked to him, and God didn't want him to go up there, so he ended up over here. a place called Troas. And then he was really lost. And he said, well, what are we supposed to do? What do we do? And he had a vision in the night of a Macedonian man who basically said, we need you to come over here. Now, this whole area over here is Macedonia. And so after that vision, he decides to go over there. And the first major place that he stops to minister is a place we've all heard of, Philippi. Okay? And this is where he founded the Philippian church. And this is where we get the letter to the Philippians. And this became probably the church that may be the most near and dear to his heart. The Philippian church or the Ephesian church, one of the two. But he goes to Philippi and Philippolis, and then he goes to Apollonia, and then another place you've heard of, Thessalonica. This is where you get 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Now, interestingly enough, I know we're going from Galatians to 1 Corinthians, but actually, in chronological order, it's Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians. Now, I'm skipping the Thessalonian books because there's a lot more of a stigma that goes with those, and there's a lot more people love to take those books and say it's all about the end times and the Antichrist and when is Jesus coming back and yada yada yada. I don't read it like that as much. Studying it myself, Paul has some very practical things he wants to encourage the Thessalonian churches with. The bottom line is I don't want to go into it right now. I'd rather go into 1 Corinthians because it's a change of pace from what we were doing in Galatians. And I think probably we'll deal with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians as a pair in one shot because they're much shorter books. But he goes to Thessalonica, Berea, and you guys know Berea because I say be Berean because the Thessalonican Jews freaked out and beat him and left him for dead. And then he went to Berea, and the Berean Jews were like, okay, well, what do you have to say? And they studied diligently to see if what he was saying was true. And they said, what you're saying lines up with the scripture. And so they accepted Christ, which was a big deal. So be as the Bereans do. And he goes all the way down here. He stops in Athens, where he spoke at Mars Hill. And then he goes over here to Corinth. And this is his first contact with the city of Corinth here. You can read about that in Acts chapter 18 is when he lands in Corinth. And see, his missionary strategy seems to have been to stop at all the really big name cities along the way and to plant a church in every one of them. I think he was really smart to do that because the way the Roman Empire was set up, it was kind of the first major empire that spread across most of the known world and then put roads everywhere. And so you had a ton of traveling. You had people that would just travel from place to place like he could. You couldn't really do that before the Roman Empire showed up. You had traveling salesmen that would go from city to city and sell things. You had sailors that would come just be passing through places. And I think Paul knew if you plant a church in every major area, there's going to be people coming through. Maybe the gospel gets spread to them, and then they just keep going on their way, and they can spread the gospel to places that I'll never get to reach. It's like a virus almost. You get it set in one place, it's going to spread all over the Roman Empire, which is a really good, it was a really good way of putting it, because that's exactly what happened. You have it right over here. That's where Christianity started. And you have this infestation of Christians all over the Roman Empire within like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 30 years. Suddenly it's dominated. It's pretty interesting. And so Paul is actually going to stay in Corinth for long. He stayed longer in that one city than he did in all the rest of the traveling he did. So the missionary journey was 2.5 years, but he stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years of that. So he poured a lot of effort into that place. 1.5 years of that, according to Acts 18, verse 11. 18 months. And so as might be expected, he definitely met with some opposition. His strategy was to go to the synagogue first, and he would speak to the Jews there and present them with the gospel, and they kind of like, we're not really interested. They kind of threw him out and dealt with him harshly. So he said, fine, I'll go to the Gentiles, which is kind of is what he did. The Jews don't accept me, I'll go to the Gentiles. And so he went to the Gentiles, and he actually had some decent success. Obviously, you can't expect a city like Corinth to be like, yeah, let's become Christians. Because obviously their morals were really messed up. It was very counter what they wanted to do. But he had some success, and specifically, there were some people who were people of influence in, the Gentile government there in Corinth. And he was able to convert them, and because they were of influence, it kind of helped the church spread, and the church kind of maintained its place for a long period of time. And the church, as you might guess, was very similar to the Galatian church in that it's made up mostly of Gentiles. So he's there for 1.5 years. He's establishing the church. He's building it up. And finally, he's going to leave, go to Ephesus, and then back to Jerusalem. And that's where he's going to end his missionary journey, or his second one. But again, after a year and a half, you can expect that there's a decent church built up by that point. And he's kind of left it with leadership, and he's established the whole thing. That was his strategy, was not to kind of set up things that were going to fall apart whenever he left, but things that were going to have an infrastructure and were going to function for a long period of time, even after he was long gone. Now, obviously, as we see from 1 Corinthians, the letter, and the fact that it exists, it wasn't as well established as he might have hoped, because they had some serious issues, as we're going to see. But once again, he's there for a year and a half. He goes to Ephesus, and we know Ephesus because that's where he writes the letter to Ephesians, which is very well known as well. And then he ends the missionary journey over here. Now, his third missionary journey is significant because it's during the third missionary journey that he's going to write 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Okay? And here's how it looked. He went to Jerusalem to end it, and then he went back up to Antioch again, and he started his third missionary journey. He's kind of making another loop. That's exactly what he does. He makes another loop. He goes back through the Galatian churches again, going through and visiting all the churches he established, encouraging them. What's funny is you're like, wait, he's doing this again? He just went there. But for him, that was like, well, that was 2 years ago. And now I'm coming back again. It's kind of just what he does at this point until he got arrested. Right here. He got arrested.
Sounds funny, doesn't it?
Yeah. Arrested, and then he got drug up here, and then he got sailed all the way. Sailed, and he crash landed over here, and then it was over here. Anyway, all kinds of crazy stuff. He had a nutso life. But he goes back through here, and then he stops here at Ephesus. And so the third missionary journey is technically the longest. The reason for that being, he was in Ephesus for 2.5 years. His main reason for this journey was to go back to Ephesus, because he established a church there right at the end of his second, but he really wanted to get back to Jerusalem. And so he said, I've got to leave you guys. And they were begging him, please don't leave. Please come back if you have to leave. And so he came back to them, and he stayed with them for a long time. And as a result, the Ephesian church was going to become one of the most well-established, effective churches in the world after him being there for 2.5 years. But the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's right here that he starts getting wind of some problems happening over here. Okay? He's in Ephesus. This is going to be roughly 53 to 56 AD. Okay? So right around 20 years after Christ died. And so the gospel has been spreading for 20 years at this point. And so it's right here we get to the why the letter was written in the first place. So he's in Ephesus, and he starts hearing about these problems that the Corinthian church is having. And he's going to hear these from 3 different sources. Okay? 3 different sources. And the first of which, right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, he mentions the first source. And he basically says, Chloe's people told me about some issues you were having. Chloe's people. These are the sources. Chloe's people. And Chloe, it's very likely that Chloe was the name of somebody who was a member of the church. Maybe she helped house it or something, but either way, it seems like she was sending people to deliver an oral message to Paul about some problems the church was having. Okay, that's the first thing he mentions. He's writing this letter, and he's saying, I wanted to respond to you about some of these things I heard from Chloe's people. Second, he actually got a letter from the Corinthian church asking him a bunch of questions. Asking him to clarify a bunch of things. The whole thing is this list of questions that they wanted to know, they wanted his help with. And he mentions this letter that they wrote to him at the beginning of chapter 7, at the beginning of chapter 8, at the beginning of chapter 12. He mentions it repeatedly. This letter you wrote to me, asking me all these questions. I want to help answer these questions you wrote to me about. And so that was the second source that he got about the problems they were having. And finally, we'll just say the church representatives. Church representatives. Right at the end of 1 Corinthians, he talks about a visit from 3 men representing the church and some things that were reported to him about the church from those 3 men. It's in chapter 16, verse 17, and he talks about Stephanas, Achaicus, and Fortunatus. These 3 men from the Corinthian church that came to him and were reporting some of the problems he was having. And so these 3 areas right here, these 3 sources that he's getting all these problems told to him from. And 1 Corinthians is a letter that in essence is him responding to these 3 sources. The first 2 chapters are him responding to what he's been told by Chloe's people. I would say chapters 1 and 2. No, wait. Chapters 1 through 4 are what he's been told by Chloe's people. The next 2 chapters, chapters 5 and 6, are what he was told by the church representatives. And the final major section, the majority of the book, chapters 7 through 16, is Paul answering the questions that they asked him in this letter. Okay? This is the basic way that the letter is set up. And really, that's what the letter is. He's trying to respond to all these problems that he's been hearing about. Okay? And so we're already almost near the end of what we need to know before we can go in it. So very quickly, I'm going to go over what the problems the church was having, like the problems that were being reported to him, because there were not a lot. It wasn't like there were like 40 different problems, but they were significant enough that he felt like he needed to respond to them pretty quickly. So first of all, and he hears this from these 2 over here, the church was experiencing problems in unity. Which, I mean, of course, any church experiences problems in unity. But specifically, they were dividing themselves up into kind of almost like sects within the church, like their own little parties, if you will. And the reason they were dividing themselves up is because they were picking their like the leaders or their teachers that they said, I want to be trained by this guy, or I follow this church leader, and he's the one I prescribe to. So they'd say, well, I am of Paul. I am of Paul's school of thought, and that's what I do. And some would say, well, I am of Apollos. And Apollos was another very powerful Christian teacher that rose up in the early time that Paul came in contact with around the time he was in Ephesus. And say, well, I'm of Apollos. And others would say, well, I am of Peter. And others would say, well, you guys are stupid because I am of Christ. And they would division themselves up into these little parties, and they were fighting and bickering over which one was right. And Paul is responding to that in 1 Corinthians, first of all. Second, as you might have guessed from the fact that we're in Corinth, you've got several serious moral issues that shouldn't have been even questions, but some of them were kind of asking questions about like, hey, should we be doing this? And Paul's like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. Paul, how many drugs should we be shooting up in the weekend? He's like, none drugs. But it's Corinth, so you've got to expect that there's going to be some things that would be obvious to some people that are just not obvious to them, because it's a very corrupt city, it's a corrupt society. Obviously, you've got the Temple of Aphrodite over there. One major issue that rose up in the church where they were wigging out was there was a member of the church whose parents were also members of the church, and his father had remarried, and then his father died, and so he's got a stepmom. And then he hooked up with his stepmom, which is really messed up, weird, kind of like taboo thing. And they were like, hey, Paul, here's what's going on, would you say that's pretty good? Would you say, we're free from the law, right? You taught us that we're not bound to the law, so we can do that, right? And Paul's like, no, you can't do that. Hey, guys. Uh-oh.
She did her phone because she couldn't text you. Okay, she doesn't want you, by the way. She wants
He wasn't crying before when we walked in the room, and everyone was looking at him.
got his feelings hurt.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the moral issues that pop up here and there. And then finally, you have confusion and even some arguing and contention about spiritual gifts, as I mentioned earlier. Questions of like, the Corinthians were saying, well, which gift is the best gift? And wait a minute, isn't tongues the best? And aren't I the holiest because I can speak in tongues and this guy can't? And well, yeah, I mean, it's nice that you have the gift of hospitality, but I can speak in tongues or I can prophesy. And the whole question of what gift is the best? And are gifts qualified in terms of the best? And what's the purpose of spiritual gifts in the first place? Which is what prompts Paul to talk about love in chapter 13 in the first place. It's chapter 12 where he talks about all the gifts, and then he goes into love as the greatest gift. And so those are the three major categories of issues that were going on within the church. And Paul is addressing every single one of them, and that's 1 Corinthians. The way Paul addresses them, he's trying, first of all, to fix the problems. Second of all, he's trying to deal with all the questions they were asking him. And third of all, there was one last thing the Corinthians were doing. You guys remember way near, or way at the beginning and the end of Galatians, Paul defends his apostolic authority. He's like, I have the right to speak into your lives. I have the right to teach. I have the right given by God. I have the right blessed to me by other apostles. I have apostolic authority over you guys, the churches. And remember, at the end of Galatians, he says, let no one trouble me again about these things. Like, I've clearly demonstrated that I have the authority here. The Corinthians give him some woe about his apostolic authority. They start questioning it. And so he spends some time within this book defending it. And so that's the book. 1 Corinthians is a book in which we have Paul, he's a pastor, and he's dealing with a problem church. And in seeing how he deals with it and taking all these major issues and relationship and unity and all this stuff and seeing the way he deals with it, as a result, it's full of really incredible teaching and it's very practical. Very, very practical. With Galatians, I mean, you kind of have to take the principle that he taught and then make it apply to your life. That makes sense. It's not like, oh, I should just do this. With Corinthians, it's very much like, you should be doing that. You shouldn't be doing this. And it's mostly very practical and straightforward in that regard. How to deal with relationships, how to deal with problem people, and that kind of thing. And what is interesting to me, as we begin to wrap this up here, what you have in 1 Corinthians is a really interesting contrast with Galatians. And it's a contrast in this sense. For those of you who are with us for a few weeks in studying Galatians, do you guys remember what the single major problem the Galatian church had?
They were trying to go back to the law.
Yeah, they started prioritizing the external law and external actions over relationship with God. And so the Galatians needed to be shown that they need to be walking in freedom from the external law. There's like a liberty. They're free now. They're no longer bound to that. And they're walking in relationship with God. They're no longer bound to this external thing. So that was what the Galatians had. But with the Corinthians, you have almost the opposite problem. Their problem wasn't in like, we're so bound to the external law, we're so bound to following all the right things that we're missing the point. Their problem was like, we're free, we're Christians, and we're not bound to the external law, and we can do anything. We can do this and that, and we're free. It's the whole thing. We're saved by grace, not by works, and therefore we don't have to do any works. And there's nothing we don't have to do, and it doesn't matter how much we sin, because in the end, we're just sinners and we're saved by grace. I'm saying it like that because that's what a lot of people believe today. And so this was their problem. Their problem wasn't that they needed to be shown that they were free. The problem was that they were a little too free, and they needed to be shown the limits. They needed to be shown that freedom from the law does not equate to freedom from moral principles. Freedom from the external law doesn't mean freedom from the internal law, because there is a difference. And that is the book. That's 1 Corinthians. That's what it's all about. It's not just a list of random, colloquialisms or whatever else. It's teaching. He's addressing these issues. Is it your... Yeah, go for it.
Who's What's Chloe's people like? What is that exactly?
So
I know it's
when,
like off
when
topic.
Paul was in Ephesus, he's doing ministry in Ephesus, and he hears about some problems that are happening in the Corinthian church. He's going to hear about those problems from 3 sources.
Yeah.
Chloe's people, is what he says in Acts chapter 1.
A
He
random
says,
woman named
Chloe's
Chloe.
people told me. And so that's all we have. We
Somebody in
have
the
Chloe's
church?
people, which is
Oh,
probably, there's a lady named Chloe in the church, and she sent people to Paul
Okay,
to
I was
give him-
confused. I didn't know if that was like a certain. I don't know.
to give him an oral report of what was going on. And then he also hears from a letter that the Corinthian church sent him, and finally from a group of representatives that were sent to him.
Okay.
And so in the first 4 chapters, he responds to what he heard from Chloe's people, 5 and 6, from representatives, 10 to 16.
Got it. Okay.
Questions in the letter. Yeah. And so, wrapping this up here, because really, I mean, you guys can see how it's a lot more straightforward than what you have in Galatians. You don't need this whole massive background about the Jewish people and their stigma against the Gentiles and this wall they had and their obsession with the law. It's as simple as, hey, there were some serious problems in this church, and Paul's telling them what to do and what not to do. Most books are as straightforward, or even more straightforward than this when it comes to reading up on the background. If you read up on Philippians, for instance, all you need to know: Paul founded Philippians. He was very close to the church. Paul was imprisoned and was just informed that he wasn't going to be executed and he was going to be freed. That is the background of Philippians. That's it. Okay? You don't need to know anything else. You need to know he loved the church very dearly, and he had just been freed, and so he's really happy.
Did he start that church?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Almost every church he wrote to, he started. Not Romans, not Colossians. That's it. He started all the other ones he wrote to. I hope I'm not saying something that's a lie. I'm trying to think. I think he found all of them. Mm-hmm.
I heard exactly the opposite about Philippians. What you just said. Basically, they say he's in prison and he's basically hopeless at that point. It's just.
No, he wrote that while he was in prison. He wrote Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon when he was imprisoned. And then he was freed, and he was really happy. He was in prison in Rome, and then he was imprisoned again. And during that second imprisonment, he wrote 2 Timothy, which is probably the most downer book that Paul wrote. It's very sad, because he knew he was about to die, and he was giving his last words to his closest disciple. 1 Timothy is happy, it's good, everything's great. Titus is fine, it's good, because he was free during that time. He was like roaming around. This is after he was released. Philippians, you can see there's definitely a tone where he's talking about how he's imprisoned, he's in chains, but there's a distinct tone of optimism in the book. And you could say he's optimistic because he's been told he's going to die and he's just being optimistic anyway, or he's optimistic because he's going to be released soon. And he was released soon after writing that. Whereas in 2 Timothy, it's very much a...
Is that where he died?
2 Timothy, he died right after writing 2 Timothy. It was the second imprisonment, and he was martyred. He was beheaded.
Oh gosh.
His right as a Roman citizen. But yeah, you can see in 2 Timothy, he's not like, surely I'll be free and surely I'll be great and happy. But it was very clear that he was going to die, and he knew it at that point, and he did. So all that to say, yes, Corinthians is so much more simple to take the background of than Galatians, and even a lot of other books are even more simple than that. Colossians, he never even went to Colossae. He just wrote to the churches in the region to kind of encourage them. That's the background. And you just read it for what it is, an encouragement to a general area of churches, like a just general word of doctrine and encouragement. And so here's 4 interesting facts about the book of 1 Corinthians, and then we're done. Okay? First of all, when you take the early church fathers, and by the early church fathers I mean like Irenaeus and these guys who were right after the New Testament ended. These guys were the leaders of the church that you don't read about, okay? In like 80 AD and 90 AD, guys like that. Polycarp, Irenaeus, stuff like that. They quoted from 1 Corinthians more than any other writing that Paul did.
Who? Sorry.
The early church fathers. So the
Okay.
leaders of the church kind of after the apostles were dead, they quoted from 1 Corinthians more than any other writing. Which is significant because back then they didn't have like a Bible. Like, let's go to the bookstore and buy a Bible so we can read from it. They just had these copies of letters that the apostles wrote that they would kind of pass around and read from and be encouraged by. And they would do that with 1 Corinthians more than anything else. Or more than any other letter that Paul wrote. And so that should tell you how important it was and how important it is. And furthermore, how useful it is. It's extremely useful in forming an idea of how to deal with people and how to deal with community and how to run a church and how to deal with conflict and all the above. So that's pretty interesting and noteworthy. Second of all, the 1 Corinthians is like the one place where Paul actually makes a distinction between his opinion and God's commands.
Can you say that again?
It's like it's one of the only places, if not the only place in Paul's writings, where he makes a distinction between his opinion and God's opinion. Make sense?
Yeah.
Most of the time he'll say something like, God wants relationship over works. Okay? He didn't ever actually say that, but I'm just giving you an example. And he doesn't say, that's my opinion, but you should assume that anyways. He just says it, matter of fact. There's actually a place in Corinthians, a couple places, where he says, this is just my opinion, but I don't think you should do this. This is just my opinion, but I don't think men should bother getting married. That's what he says. I think men will be more effective if they're not married. They're more free to spread the gospel. Is he wrong? No. He's right. If Paul had a wife and kids, he could never have done any of this. He'd never have been as effective. However, there are things that a husband and father can do that a single man can never do. There are ways that God can use a person wherever you're at. There are roles that need to be played one way or another. Paul's role was to be single and to be a workhorse. Whereas a husband and father can't be nearly as much of a workhorse because you are responsible to a wife and you're responsible to children and you have other responsibilities other than just your church and your flock and your ministry. But that was Paul's opinion. And the reason he says it's his opinion is because it's fallible. He doesn't say, God doesn't think any men should be married, so you could be God's workhorses. He says, it's my opinion, but you can be more effective if you don't get married. He's not wrong.
Is that the place where it says it's better to be?
Yep.
Okay.
Better than a man not be married.
Yeah, something like that.
But that's his opinion. He's just like, no, that's just me.
Yeah.
You know? Which is interesting because you don't see that a lot. And it's noteworthy within the New Testament. Next, 1 Corinthians along with 2 Corinthians are possibly the best look that we get in the New Testament of how the New Testament church was organized. How the church looked, how it was structured, the methods of the church, the message of the church. Probably the best look we get. However, we should remember as we're reading this that the Corinthian church is probably not the best example of what a church looked like in the day. It was a problem church, and it was likely non-typical in terms of the congregations. It was in Corinth, for crying out loud. Last but not least, I mentioned this before, but the book is hugely practical. Hugely practical. There's all kinds of things you can just read and go, wow, I can use that in real life. I can use that to solve the next time I'm in a conflict. Because it's full of godly principles and godly advice for relating with people and how to deal with people who have messed up and how to deal with people who are estranged from you and how to deal with people who have betrayed you and all that kind of thing. So very practical. It's not nearly as focused on doctrine as books like Ephesians or Romans might be. Although both of those books have a lot of practical things in them as well, just also lots of doctrine. Okay, and that's it. And that is everything you need to know before you can go into Corinthians and just like read the book from beginning to end and hopefully follow it. And so that's what we'll be doing. Starting next week, We're going to pick one chapter 1, and we're going to go as reasonably paced as possible to get through the whole book. There are so many statements he makes that just don't need to be explained. That some of them we just won't even explain them. You say, that's straightforward. I mean, anyone have any questions about that? Of course not, because it's straightforward. Let's move on. Now, there are problem statements. Just like in Galatians, there are statements he says, you're like, whoa, what is he saying there? Like, he wants to give that man over to the devil? What do you mean, give a man over to the devil? Why would you ever want to do that? Things like that he says, where you go, that's a little strange, Paul. What does he mean? And how is that practical? How is that relevant today? That we will be going through so we can understand the book. But there's a lot of stuff it's rife for discussion, and I'm pretty excited about going into it. So we'll pick that up. Chapter 1, I want to see if we can get all the way from the beginning of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 2. 2 chapters in 1 week. So we'll see if we can do that. And so if you guys want to read 2 chapters, if you're planning on being here next week,
Read first and second? Or
first chapter and second chapter
of Corinthians?
of 1 Corinthians. What did I say?
Probably that.
Okay. Yeah,
I was
just
thinking of it.
chapter 1 and chapter 2 we're going to try to go through next week. And if you guys read it and come with any like thoughts or questions, or if you even want to like write down things like what in the world does that mean, I love that kind of stuff. I love when people come with heavy-hitting questions to go into and discuss. Anyway, we're done. Thanks, guys.